Hey, welcome back. Still in the podcast. We're now into the deeper sections here. We finally are making it to the more alternative perspectives on history. Now, can we first define what our particular lens of history we're using right now?
Right now we're using the speculative lens. We're not really looking at the details so much as we're looking at the general motives, generally what might have happened, and I wonder if this thing changing that thing does anything.
And for particularly younger or newer viewers who aren't as to that level of perspectives of history, history isn't just about the remembrance of dates, times, and peoples, and the more heroic figures of particular nation states. It's more about what sort of the general pattern might be of how history may occur, and how applying pressure as a force over some amount of time through some sort of considered plans or efforts might change where things are going and towards where they could be heading. So what we're really going to start looking at over what now is going to be a 3-part series through the rest of the podcast is what sort of causes and what sort of the interesting things that people probably haven't heard about what made this huge conflict.
Some of these figures are so minor that the Wikipedia pages are barely more
non-existent. We're hoping to sort of flesh out stuff from what we can delve through and find. So first we'll go through the causes, then we'll go through what happened during the conflict. I call that the plans, to then eventually the outcomes. This is going to be quite longer sort of pieces, but for all we know after doing what we just recorded, these are going to be roughly the same length as all the other segments. These things happen. So where do you want to start with the causes?
Oh, man. So starting with the causes, you probably have to go back to the earliest traces of a cause.
So let's far back. What was happening in the 18th century?
In the 18th...
19th century.
19th century is where things begin to really start happening to get towards this. 19th century was mainly dominated in the very early part by the Napoleonic Wars. And then
they get eventually resolved.
They get resolved, and then we get a concert of Europe,
a series of diplomatic backward talkings that instead of going to big scale, total European domination,
except for the Crimea,
and the Franco-Prussian
War might matter, and Franco-Austrian War, but
minor blemishes as opposed to
going to
20, 30 years of all-out conflict. Fundamentally, we had that, or Europe had that sort of system, and then it eventually crumbled in the turn of the century, between 1800 and the 1920th century.
By about late 90s through to 1910, the concept of Europe was in flames. The people who started it were dead, and they didn't train good successors. The people who really believed in it didn't live long, and
didn't even get to choose
their successor at all.
Right.
And
equally, the big other part within the 19th century is that you saw the rise of new sort of nation states that were no longer just the more traditional Westphalian.
We have a king. He rules a state.
King and maybe a small urban region, to things that now were very much these industrial blocks.
Out of things that used to be major powers in Europe. A prime example is Germany is one of these states. Bavaria used to be a massive power player in Europe for a long time.
But you usually
Prussia was another one.
Prussia being a very strong sort of player.
Saxony was a player for a long time.
And then you had all these that then had to
they all melded together.
Not always. not because they wanted to all the time. Equally had a different patchwork being created. The Austrian Empire, that while it's more traditional, it sort of was made and composed of various different groups, all ruled by the Habsburgs.
At the beginning of the 19th century, it was still known as the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
Then Napoleon got rid of that, and then it was the Austrian Empire, and then there was a kerfuffle, and then they had to admit to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then things just got weird.
The big point is they don't share a language. They don't really share a religion or any
Not well.
any real points to be together.
They just share a bunch of princes who are
other than the people who do rule them are the same.
Yeah.
Then you have the Italian states, which molded together.
Sort of more. The Italian states are very weird. And what I recommend doing is there's an amazing book that I read a while ago. It's called The Force of Destiny. It really covers the unification of Italy perfectly. Okay. It's great.
So fundamentally, essentially, you're starting to consolidate.
Yeah. Or deconsolidate, in the case of the Austrians.
Yeah, we're fine. France and Britain were still established powers.
Busily guzzling up parts of the world.
Russia, for Africa. Russia still
vaguely tried to modernize, and then it stopped doing that, and it started doing that again, and it's Russia. Okay. They try to do
19th century does this sort of thing. We eventually run out, and diplomacy sort of falls short.
Yes. The start of that sort of thing falling apart can often be traced to a couple of 19th century causes. Okay. One of them is the death of a rather less well-known Kaiser.
Are you want to go that way, or
I want to start with him, just because.
So this one is probably more obscure than.
He's one of the most obscure characters in all of this morass. Okay. He's a man who only ruled his country for 99 days.
Okay.
His father was the Kaiser over Bismarck when the German Empire became an empire, and he lived for an extremely long time, making it to 90, which is impressive in these days.
Right. I mean, it's even impressive now.
It's even impressive now. This is a dude who's fat and smoked all the time. Mind blown, right?
With all that said,
his son.
The difference would be is that the father was quite conservative.
Yes, immensely conservative and very amenable to certain conservative pressures.
And then we're talking about traditional conservatism.
Prussian conservatism.
We're talking about
the king,
kings, nobility. No representative rights,
no elections,
and then if you're going to have these things, then they're going to have to be done via the traditional powers.
Yes.
That
you might have junkers getting together to elect things,
like old kings and nobility, old churches.
It's not the modern definition of conservatism at all.
No, we're not. Yeah, we're not talking about that.
Those guys are still radicals.
The old school conservatives, which we don't really see in Western sort of English-speaking world.
They're mostly gone.
Nor do we talk about a far alt-right, not by any extent of the imagination.
That's different. That comes later.
Or far right, or
any of that.
No. We're talking about the old Bismarck style conservative.
This is realpolitik conservative.
So that was what the father was.
Yes.
Then you have
the son,
who's Frederick
III of Prussia. He's technically also Kaiser Friedrich III, but that's a little bit confusing because there's actually another.
They're all called Frederick or Frederick Wilhelm.
Yes, but the problem is there's a Holy Roman Emperor who called himself Frederick III, and there's a whole giant mess once you start getting into that because
the 90 Day Kaiser.
Yeah. The 99-Day Kaiser was a radical liberal.
There we go.
He backed the Progressive Party in Germany, which was known for wanting silly things like actual elections, a British-style democracy, which would be parliamentarianism,
democracy,
well represented and decently good at separating things.
Well, let's be honest, modern Germany, even for the way it started, it probably is still a much better democracy.
Oh, no, yes.
But that's something of the 20th century.
That's the 20th century democracy.
Anyway,
this is the 19th century democracy.
We're not getting into that.
Anyhow.
So this guy was a liberal and wanted to liberalize the German Empire.
Radically. And he wanted to do it. He wanted to get rid of Bismarck, which would be ridiculous and unheard of. He wanted to adopt an actual constitution that the Kaiser had to be held to, which was...
Well, I mean...
They sort of had one, but the Kaiser could renege it at any point.
Right, and it was very much a king-oriented...
Yeah. And he was also very well known for another reason. He was married to Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, meaning...
he had very deep British ties.
He was at Victoria's Jubilee.
Oh.
Yeah,
Nice.
in full dress, and was attributed. He interviewed with more British newspapers than any other German king ever.
Well, I mean, if the other side of life is,
Including
particularly for the Great War,
Yeah.
most of the leaders were related to each other.
This is back when these are the guys who actually made themselves related.
But that's because of that concept of Europe that had those close
Yes.
ties that made this whole thing sort of happen.
Yes.
But he had the opportunity that if he had lived,
he could have pursued a very different Germany with very close ties to Britain and be radically different.
right, and had broken up that fundamental central powers as sort of outcome.
The triple alliance of Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Germany would be missing Germany.
Right, and then whatever ties they have with the Ottomans and the Bulgarians on top of that.
Yeah.
So, he didn't live though.
He did not live. He died of esophageal cancer from smoking too much while being asthmatic. And he was suffering for this for many years through his life. And the entirety of the time he was Kaiser, he was slowly dying.
Right.
He didn't even march at his father's funeral because he was still on his deathbed. So you got his son, who is
this is the big that's good. Kaiser Wilhelm.
Kaiser Wilhelm, the guy.
The big part of the
this.
reason, definitely why the whole war comes through, and this definitely gets to the more traditional reason for what's known for the war.
Yeah. Is that Kaiser Wilhelm was raised a militant Prussian. He very much believed in the authority of kings and that he was...
Who raised him?
Oh, he was also directly raised by his father and one Otto von Bismarck.
Oh, so he was raised by the liberal or...
Otto von Bismarck,
so
the conservatives.
He was taken from his own mother.
He was taken from his mother and raised by the most nutjob radical conservatives in Prussia, which probably means the most nutjob radical conservative spelled with a K ever.
So, and that's really the big force on history.
Yeah.
The power play for within the
So everyone who goes, oh yeah, they're all related. They're all related, but there's related, and then there's...
Well, no, he's still...
You're related, but you don't spend time
blood,
with them.
Blood relation. He still had contact with many cousins.
It's just he was educated by nutjobs.
Right. The big part, and this is where we will tie a link through all of what we're these three segments, is fundamentally if he had not been trained this way, then the whole German part of this war could play out completely differently.
Yes.
And then the whole causes can be completely changed.
Yes.
So, anyways, that's the big conflict between 99 Kaiser and Bismarck.
Yes. The other problem with Bismarck, as long as we're talking about the Iron Chancellor, is there was no real replacement for him at Chancellor who was as good at juggling the concert of Europe.
So fundamentally, we're not talking about someone who is like the legitimized divine authority, which is what Wilhelm is.
Yes.
We're talking about someone who's doing the power background plays.
Yes. The real problem is he took a boy king and basically said, you have divine right, a whole bunch of other things, not quite actually divine right, but anyway.
Fine.
Step off that. And then that kid said, I don't need you. When that dude was the one man single-handedly still holding
and
the
he
concert
didn't need
Europe
somebody
together.
like him to fundamentally do the dirty work.
Yes.
And the beauty
his grandfather needed him.
Right. We'll link to a couple series that sort of support this. Of course, it's back to the extra credits.
Yeah. Good old Otto.
Yeah. So that sort of does what's going on. And top this off, Germany was the rising power.
Yep.
Had ambitions of actually having colonies.
Many of them.
And
didn't
really have a spot on the table exactly.
They managed to be able to participate in the scramble for Africa.
Okay.
They did get a few African colonies. The problem
they do have a colony in China.
And they have a couple of islands. That's not much.
South Pacific.
Yeah.
With that said,
they were looking at the kinds of colonies that Britain and France had and going, oh man, we should colonize.
Yeah. Okay.
So that point in EU forward,
definitely
damn. They did that.
Anyway, let alone the fact that probably most of the United States is built off of German immigrants.
Yes.
Or
those liberals running away.
Yeah, all kinds of people that are running away.
Catholics too.
And German Jews.
And everybody.
Not just for that period, but the periods before.
Well before.
And all forms of, just Pennsylvania Deutsch.
Yeah, WWI.
Who ran centuries before that.
Yeah. From Napoleon.
Right. German immigrants equally moved through the South Americas.
Yeah.
And
of course, we can't talk about German immigrants without mentioning South Africa.
More Dutch, but
more Dutch, but they were there.
Yeah. So they didn't really have control over
their immigrant populations.
Yeah. And they weren't really still in the same, what would you call that, mercantilist.
They left the sphere.
Yeah, they left the sphere of influence that political culture could control. Yeah. Okay. I want to move on to Italy for what's going on with them.
Oh boy, Italy!
You want to do the Duke Dive?
Yeah. Italy, walking into the early 20th century, was a power that had just unified.
We already talked about that.
And is basically trying to figure out, okay, I'm stuck to the Triple Alliance, but I really don't like Austria. I fought a series of wars against Austria, and those guys are assholes. So they've stopped us from getting more stuff. They've finally gotten Libya off the Ottomans, and they basically have sat around and gone, I don't really like my buddies anymore. I mean, I like Germany. They're fine. But Austria is an asshole. I don't trust Ottomans? No. I've gone to war with them too many times, and
they just fought the war.
Yeah.
So they do the dual alliance.
They do the dual alliance in a secret back room, not actually with either the president or the current prime minister at the time, which is hilarious because Italian politics. It was actually the foreign secretary doing it entirely on his own with no authority. And then he became prime minister and said, we're doing it. Because Italians.
It just goes to show that democracy has its ways
of doing things.
And how far we sunk here in the United States.
Pretty much. And then there was a very ambitious general. So Italy wants to stay neutral at the beginning of the war. They go, I don't really like either of these guys. I'm going to just sit it out.
You're not getting to the plans. We'll get to that in the next section. Fundamentally, you had Britain and France were to establish powers, like we already said. Russia was fairly well established in its own area of
different kind of established power
of the East.
Yeah.
But you then equally have two other major causes that, if you're looking more on the thematic stage of the Great War, these things are definitely going to go through. And part one, and this is really the sparking causes of the war, rather than the context that you're discussing, is you have these rise of small nations, new ethnic nations, nationalisms, whatever you want to call them, that
Slavistan
haven't. Well, no, not just the Slavic countries, that needed their independence from the Austrians. But also
the Ottomans.
You also have Middle Eastern ethnic groups that need their independence from the Ottomans.
You also have Armenians trying to do the same thing.
Yes, the Arabs, the Kurds equally.
We're thinking about it.
They still side with the Ottomans at times, and the whole thing is played off. But you usually have the Zionist movement get its support from Britain during this war.
Yes.
And begin to move into the Palestine region.
The Balfour.
Equally, at other segments of the world, you have the Poland finally being allowed by the other imperial powers
to exist
in the other imperial power.
Yeah, as opposed to just being Germany, Austria, and Russia.
At the end of the conflict, it finally comes back into existence.
After a very long time.
Equally, this is where Irish republicanism goes merely from being plans and thoughts and dreams and poetry and vague terrorists to
freedom fighters. They're freedom fighters.
No, they were at the time. We're talking about just vague murderers.
They were doing it for the Irish Nationalist cause.
Yes, in the 1840s and 90s and whatnot. But literally right after the outbreak of or the conclusion of World War I, the soldiers do come back, and you finally get the Easter Rising push.
Yeah.
Which then goes straight into the early 20s with the
actual Irish
right.
Civil War, separation war,
War.
Whichever you want to call that.
Other parts of the world are equally going through some upheaval.
Yeah.
South Africa had only just finished up the Boer Wars.
Yeah.
India is starting to see the rise of its own nationalism amongst the local population rather than the people with power. Predominantly Anglo-Indians,
Hindus, local Indians,
right, and various Rajas that they support.
There's the Rajas they
don't support. With the Chinese Empire fell in 1911.
Went boom.
Right. This is the birth of the original Chinese Revolution.
Yeah.
Oh, I shouldn't say original.
It's one of the original.
The grandfathered.
This is China's attempt at democracy.
This is where the various warlords, and we get the warlord period.
The warlord period comes after.
But it shows that there are a lot of sub-rising groups within what were considered countries in the 19th century that are now trying to break through.
Yes.
And become established. And really, we don't get another period of time that happens like that until the late 20th century.
Yes.
But also, you finally get sort of countercultural movements become more justified as the standard culture doesn't want to do nothing but drive people into trenches.
Yes. A fine example of this is Dada in Switzerland from a
large group. If you're going for the more of the artistic.
Yeah. You said countercultural.
I was actually
I
was going to go more with the rise of communism.
That'd be the other answer. Yeah.
Which just the revolution actually breaks through in for the most
one state
in Russia. But there are other big, and
there's the Red Scare in Italy. It was massive.
There were Red Scares through Germany and the United States and many other places for the first time at major scales, rather than minor labor districts.
Veneto Rosa is literally the Red 2 years. There was a communist government in Italy.
So a lot of the causes, sort of, the sparks are very much the rise of nations.
Yeah.
The context was everything you were describing between what Italy had to choose and what was going on with the nature of the Germans and this power play between great empires. Yeah. But the big fire that's going to keep them still going is the fact that their own people are going to rise up against them because they
are the nationalists or the communists or they're some mixture of the three.
Right. Anyways, so that's very much the causes. We're going to then definitely continue what the actual conflict is.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I believe that's next time.
Yeah. Stay continued.
Thank you for watching.